Week 3, the Sacred Spring. In the Holy Land, where rainfall is intermittent, there are two types of spring. The perennial spring, which flows all year, and the non-perennial, which flows only certain times of the year during the rainy season. Springs find their source where water has filtered down through the permeable layers of the ground. This gathered water is called the aquifer. Water is pushed up to form a spring, where the conditions are right, and there are several types of spring. Dispersion springs, which occur when the water gathers under a valley. Contact springs, when the rain falls down the side of a hill or mountain because it cannot seep in. Fracture or tubular springs, which occur when groundwater running under the surface finds a way up to the surface through cracks. Artesian springs, which are springs that typically occur at the lowest point of land, and the water is being forced out by the pressure that has built between two impermeable surfaces underground. And finally, my favourite, wonky holes, which are where fresh water finds a way through sediment-filled old canals. In biblical Hebrew, a spring is called ma'ayan, and it's also called ayin, after the Hebrew letter ayin, which can also mean eye. We can easily understand how an ancient Israelite might make that connection. Looking into quiet springs, you will see how it reflects from a glassy surface what lies above. Our own eye carries a reflection of what we see. In the Song of Solomon, the woman describes her lover's eye as a spring. His eyes are like doves beside springs of water, bathed in milk, fitly set. In this image, the spring represents the eye. The doves could represent the fluttering eyelash, and the milk the white sheen of the eye. In literature, pools have often been used as a metaphor for the eye. The spring not only reflects the wider world, but has come to be a window on the inner eye. Her eyes, twin pools of mystic light, the blend of star sheen and black night, all which to sound their glamouring haze, a man might bend and vainly gaze. Her eyes, twin pools so dark and deep, in which life's ancient mysteries sleep, wherein to seek the quested goal, a man might plunge and lose his soul. Words by James Weldon Johnson. The spring is a symbol of God's power and divine control. In the act of creation, God opens the gate of the deep to let the springs gush forth. God chooses when and where the springs will run. We are told God sets the boundaries of water, shaping the world in a hands-on, anthropomorphic way. Like a human being, God cuts things, makes things, and shapes the landscape. The Psalms describe the Judean desert as a dry and weary land where there is no water. In such harsh conditions, God's power over water was vital. In the theological perspective of the Psalms, the spring becomes a powerful image of God's control over life itself. Psalm 104, you make springs gush forth into the valleys, they flow between the hills. And Psalm 107, he turns a desert into pools of water, a parched land into springs of water. The psalmist believed that God could also bring drought. Psalm 74, you cut openings for springs and torrents, you dried up ever-flowing streams. Or Psalm 107, he turns rivers into a desert, springs of water into thirsty ground. Springs are an instrument of God's transforming power, a dramatic reminder of grace at work. One can get a vivid picture of this in Israel's flash floods. Springs open and cascade down the hillside, the desert greens, and flowers bloom as if from nowhere. Salvation. Springs are part of the salvation story of God's people. We know from Exodus and Deuteronomy that dehydration was part of the nomadic life that followed their escape from Egypt. Only 3 days after crossing the Red Sea, the people were complaining to Moses that they had been brought out of Egypt only to die in the wilderness. When they came to Marah, we are told in Exodus 15, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. That is why it was called Marah. If you remember, that has a link to Mara and Naomi in the story of Ruth. And the people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" He cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and an ordinance. Give heed to his commandments and keep all his statutes. I will not bring upon you any of the diseases I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water, 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the water. Slightly longer passage that we've edited there. But it's interesting to note in this passage that the waters were bitter. Some springs bring up sediment from the ground that makes them undrinkable. God cleanses the water and promises that the waters will not bring disease. Remember the 10 plagues when the Egyptian waters turned to blood. The people's anxiety over water becomes a test of their willingness to trust that God will provide. God is soon to be put to the test again in Exodus 17. The people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" And God says, "I will be standing there in front of you on the rock of Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it, so that the people may drink." Elisha famously restored a spring to health when he threw the salt into it, and said, "Thus says the Lord, I have made this water wholesome. From now on neither death nor miscarriage shall come from it." Deliverance. If, as the ancient Israelite believed, God controls water and has the power to cleanse and to bring water from nothing, it follows that he can be trusted with future events. Listen to Isaiah. "Joyfully you will draw water from the springs of deliverance." Isaiah 12. "I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." Isaiah 49. And in the book of Esdras, a constant, generous water supply is compared to God's grace and love. "Embrace your children until I come, and proclaim mercy to them, because my springs run over, and my grace will not fail." 2 Esdras chapter 2. Springs under threat today. As rainfall reduces due to climate change, springs are drying out more frequently, some disappearing altogether. The Middle East and Northern Africa have only about half the world's average rainfall. Droughts are regularly hitting almost 2/3 of the arable country in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, the Palestinian territories, and Iraq. Economic losses from climate-related water scarcity are predicted to reach between 6 and 14% of GDP in this region by 2050. Those figures come from the Atlantic Council. In India, in Almora, springs are disappearing at an alarming rate. Over the last 150 years, the number of usable springs in the mountainous area of Uttarakhand has gone down from 360 to a mere 60. Things to think about. Have you ever experienced a lack of water or water contamination? We heard about water and miscarriage. There was a study that said potential exposure of contaminated water increases the incidence of prematurity by 10.3% among less educated mothers. Where do you think that study took place? Actually, it was New Jersey in America. The second letter to Peter, chapter 17, tells us, "Those who give bad advice are like waterless springs." Who has been a source, a spring of good advice and guidance for you? Springs were an Israelite sign of hope. What are your signs of deliverance and hope? The psalmist felt God was leading his people by quiet waters. Have you ever felt God leading you? The Desert Father, Poemun, said that just as a deer thirsted for water, his brother monks thirsted for the springs of Jesus through the sacraments. Can our longing for God be described as a thirst? And now some suggested actions. List down people who have been a spring of good advice for you and keep it safe. On a difficult day, look at the list and remember who you can ring for support. When you feel your faith is running dry, think of the reservoir of God's love that lies just below the surface. Turn to the Psalms for inspiration. Turn a bowl of water into a place of prayer. Float a flower on it. Drop a stone in it. Walk to a pond or river and look at the reflection. Pick up litter to keep it unpolluted. Think what you put down the sink to keep our water supplies cleaner. And one I like from some children's survey: steam your food to cut water usage and retain more of the natural nutrients, or let veg cooking water cool and use it to water plants. Using the spring in our prayer life. In Christian teaching, Jesus is described as the spring, the source of life, or as the only guide to that source. Listen to the book of Revelation's description of the Last Judgment. For the Lamb at the centre of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of the water of life, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. St. Anselm wrote, "How deep is your goodness, O God! The source of your compassion is seen, but it is not seen clearly. Whence the stream flows is known, but it is not fully known whence it springs. Let that which flows from you flow into me." That could be used as a wonderful mantra. Let that which flows from you flow into me. In our Christian life, it's helpful to think about where we find the springs that we draw from. That may be the love of our family, the Bible, the sacrament, the still of a quiet church, poetry, reading, art, gardening, friendship, pilgrimage. Consider if you are nourishing or neglecting the springs that bring you life. Let's listen to John Rogerson's translation of a part of Psalm 84. How blessed are those who find their strength in you, who plan to go on pilgrimage. If they pass through the cheerless valley, it becomes a spring of water. By travelling in faith and trust with God, our lives can be enriched. Even in the times of drought and hardship, we will be drawn by God to discover the springs that bring life. A meditation. Let's close our eyes and get comfortable. We are thirsty for God's love, and that love can come to us in many ways, like water. Sometimes the power of God wells up like a force, pushing us forward in a torrent. Sometimes God is at work in a quieter, almost imperceptible way. Only small bubbles show God's activity rising within us. Sometimes God's love flows under us, like a forgotten river. The river is silted up and covered by layer upon layer of concern and tradition, but the water still seeps through. There is a small spring of hope. Love, like water, cascades down the hillside. Does it find a place to sink into our lives or run right past us? Can God's love find a place to soak in, or are we like impervious stone? God's love wells up and pushes through tiny cracks in our defences. At first it is a small trickle that over time grows into a steady stream. Sometimes, drop by drop, God carves out a channel for his love to flow through. Love, like water, gathers in deep places and rises from beneath the surface. Where are those deep places for you? Imagine you are sitting by a dry stream bed. Put your hand onto the dry, cracked earth. You are thirsty and your mouth is dry. Ask God to bring you water. Let God know you are thirsty for his love. A spring opens beside you. First a slow trickle, then a steady stream of water, then more, till it fills the stream. Watch the waters pass you by. Hear the spring's murmuring sound. A butterfly flutters by. Insects, birds, and animals have been drawn to the water. The banks are becoming green with foliage. Flowers bloom. The water is life. Put your hand into the waters and feel the cold, pure water. Push against it. Let it move around your hand, through your fingers, flowing onwards. Cup your hands together, lower them into the water, and quench your thirst. Take time to rest beside the stream. Amen.